So here today we have the Super Nintendo, or the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, which is what it says on the label right here. Super Nintendo Entertainment System. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time comparing it to the Sega Genesis, since they're both a 16-bit. I've spent the past couple of days doing some research about systems, and I found out that 16-bit is actually not really necessarily relative to the amount of graphics that a game can have. 16-bit is actually the size of the main processor in the unit. And it has nothing to do with anything else except the literal size of the processor. In fact, for example, the Sega Genesis, their processor runs higher than the Super Nintendo's processor at a higher speed. But we'll get into that later. Before I move on, I would like to thank my subscribers for subscribing, because they are awesome for doing that. And I would like to request that they make requests as to what I should review next. That way I don't have to bother to decide which system I should do. I'm going to do a recent pickups video probably next week or the week after. I'm getting some stuff on eBay. So you can look forward to some rare stuff like Sonic R, Sonic Jam, Android Assault. I'm working on getting those, and hopefully they'll be in relatively soon. So back to the Super Nintendo. Nintendo was reluctant to release the Super Nintendo because the NES was still doing relatively well. It was still popular, they were still making games for it, but Nintendo decided they needed to enter the 16-bit era because that was the new thing that Sega was bashing over their heads. That they were 16-bit and Nintendo was not. The Super Nintendo was released 2 years after the Genesis in September of 1991 in the US and sold and cost $200 against the Sega Genesis's $190, I believe, when it came out. But at this point the Sega Genesis's price was going down because it had been out for a little bit, and usually prices go down. However, the Super Nintendo did very well, mostly because it's a Nintendo system and it had done well before, and people knew it was a good company. They sold about 46 million units, which is very good. So anyway, before we get into specs, I'm gonna just go over both of these units, mostly because I like the Sega Genesis. I'm more of a Sega person than a Nintendo person, but I still love Nintendo. And my thinking is, why have only one when you can have both? This one's actually interesting because usually on the Super Nintendo systems, I'm gonna take a look at it, there is a terrible, terrible yellowing that occurs on the top layer here. Mine hasn't done that yet because what the guy I bought it from at the Playntrade had sealed it, and it had been that way for years, so there was no need to worry about that. So the system is different than the NES because it's a top loader. They did make an NES top loader, but that didn't sell very well because it came out so late in that life. But the power button slides. It's not really a button, it's a slider. It makes a nice clicking noise. There's an eject button, which makes it simpler to get your games out. And of course, your reset slider. Now the sliding thing is quite interesting. It's nice. It feels right. And of course, there's your little notices like power switch, blah blah blah. But this also has its normal light for, yes, the game system is on. Now, the controller port is very different from anything else. Most general consoles would use the simple 9-pin thing, like the Atari 2600, the Atari 7800, I believe the ColecoVision, and there's a couple other systems that also had this port configuration. So you could use an Atari 2600 controller on your Genesis. And what plugs into the controller port is this controller here. Now this one is a little bit different from the Nintendo controller. It had 4 buttons, A, B, X, Y, start, select, and your D-pad. It feels pretty comfy in my hands compared to the Nintendo controller. It even has little bumpers, R and L bumpers, which is kind of cool. It brings it a little more into the realm of complicated, I guess, I suppose. Although you don't really use these much in most games. It's still interesting. Now the other interesting thing is that this is the beginning of this new audio-video out system that Nintendo was beginning. so that you could get dual channel sound, although it wasn't as good as the Genesis. So there is your multi-out, which was used on this system, the Nintendo 64, and even the GameCube. So this port lasted a very long time. It was quite popular. And of course you've got your crappy RF, which is just annoying. And your power supply, it's one of those blocks that attaches to your wall. Now the interesting thing is there's a little plastic ring in there, and that, when the system turns yellow, it becomes brittle and breaks off, and then it's like impossible to get your power to the unit, which is really annoying. So now it is time for specs. I'm going to compare the Super Nintendo to the Sega Genesis just for reference. Now remember, the Super Nintendo came out in 1991 and the Genesis came out in 1989 in America. So you would think that the Super Nintendo would be better, and it is in some respects, but the Sega Genesis gets it in a few key areas, and they beat Nintendo over the head with that. So we're going to start with the processor. The Super Nintendo has a processor that runs at 3.58 MHz against the Sega Genesis 7.68 MHz. That's not a good sign. The Sega Genesis is over 2 times as good in terms of the processor than the Super Nintendo. However, the Super Nintendo does win out in terms of RAM. They have just over 1 MB of RAM, while Sega only has just over half a megabyte of RAM. And the Super Nintendo has half a megabyte of video RAM and has a dedicated graphics processor, which is nice. Now this surprised me when I found this out. The Super Nintendo has 32,768 colors and can display 256 at once, while the Genesis only has 512 colors and can only display 64 at once. That surprised me. I thought the Genesis had more colors than that, but I guess not. And the Super Nintendo can also do more sprites. They can do 128 sprites versus 80. Just for those of you who don't know what a sprite is, that's the thing on the screen that moves. Like, for example, when you're playing Mario, when Mario is moving across the screen, he's a sprite. Now, the Super Nintendo did have the mono out, but it didn't have a headphone jack built in like the Genesis Model 1. These are both Model 1 systems, because you got your headphone here and your slider. I like the slider. It's nice. But the Super Nintendo didn't have a slider or stereo sound unless you got the expensive AV cable, because it was more expensive than the RF cable, and most TVs at that point didn't have the audio-video cables. They only had the RF screw-in unit. And you could get stereo sound right out of a Genesis by just plugging in some headphones, which was certainly nice. Now, there was this fiasco with Nintendo, which really still hurts them to this day, which is Nintendo decided they wanted to make a CD drive for their system. So they contracted Sony and canceled, and then later Philips and canceled to make a CD unit. And that was going to plug into the bottom here, with this little extension port right there. And it's just going to go into the bottom. There's even some screws. Like here, there's a screw. And that it would screw in right there. But it never happened. Nintendo got afraid of loading times and things. Like the Sega CD. They were afraid of things like that happening. So Sony got angry and made their own CD system, which was the PlayStation, which really isn't still a competitor today. It's one of the 3 main systems that still exist to this day.